looking at the year ahead. Joining me in this segment, a couple of, well, I like to call them political wise guys. They're both political strategists in their own right. On my right is the founder and CEO of the Davis system, Anthony Davis Jr., who did some work for Mayor Wu this past election cycle. Thanks so much for coming in. Nice to see you, and thanks for coming in. And also joining us, Greg Maynard, who's the founder and
executive
director of the Boston Policy Institute, a think tank that's dedicated to looking at municipal issues, including finance and policy. Thank you both for coming in. Nice to have you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Well, why don't we start? What did you think of the speech? Rep. Michaelwitz liked it. Let's start with you, Anthony.
Yeah, I thought it was a good speech.
Yeah.
I think that the mayor obviously wanted to lay out her victories or successes from this first 4 years of her term, and also project a vision for what she hopes to do moving forward in the city. I think that one of the things that she's really championed through her first 4 years is making the city more safe. And she touted the record lows of gun violence here in the city, and she also talked about how they're working to make the city a city for everyone. Having more programs for youth in the city, and so I think it was a speech that was an opportunity to take a victory lap. Honestly, we saw.
There weren't a lot of specifics, though.
I wouldn't say about future.
What she wanted to do in the future.
Yeah, I would say.
Of course, it's an uncertain future with all that's going on in Washington, and really the impact it might have on state finances. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say in terms of future or forward-looking, I feel like what we heard was very basic city services, plan to continue to do those well, but I wouldn't say in terms of specifics and policy.
Fill those potholes. Greg, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there was kind of one statistic I think kind of like captured it. The mayor didn't say the words downtown or tax or budget in her speech. And especially when you compare that to December, where we heard a lot. We heard about falling office values. We heard about a 13% increase on homeowners' property taxes. We heard CFO Bloom over at BPS say 300 or 400 people were going to be terminated inside the system. Those sounded like really important big issues that are going to affect the city this year and in the years to come. And the mayor didn't touch on any of that.
Well, and perhaps not surprisingly, because when you're in that situation and all eyes on the mayor, you want to emphasize the positive and stay away from some of those ticklish issues. What are, in you guys' minds, the biggest challenges that the mayor does face? And you mentioned tax and downtown and economy, et cetera. How does that translate, Greg? And then we'll come back to you.
Yeah, so I think you saw, one of the big reasons that we saw this really big property tax increase here in Boston was not only the falling office values, it's also that Boston had record low growth in FY26. And what we heard from CFO Grauffenberger also in December is that she expects FY27 and FY28 to be even lower than FY26. And I think that points to this issue that we've seen in Boston, which is that this administration has had real difficulties in being able to build things in the city, right? We heard the mayor talk a lot about affordable housing units. The reality is most of those affordable housing units that were being built are being built on projects that were conceived and approved under the Walsh administration.
Well, and of course, I guess we shouldn't be surprised, kind of given all the threats of potential cutbacks coming from Washington and various pots of money, even though majority of the tax revenue or the revenue that the city gets comes from property taxes. Is she in a spot here? Maybe it's the calm before the storm, or it's you want to kind of enjoy this while you can, because there's some really hard decisions coming up.
Absolutely, yeah, I would agree with that. I think that, as Greg said, that there's an affordability crisis right now in the city that will need to be addressed, and that will be the main talking point of our next administration. And then I would also say, back to your question, that there needs to be some restoration of trust within the political the body, not only with the mayor but the city council right now, that I think will plague her second administration.
What do you mean?
how, like, we saw the city council vote play out on Monday in a way that was very favorable to the mayor, and I think right now there's a question amongst the community of whether or not the mayor and the city council is going to move in an independent, whether or not the city council will be independent of the mayor's influence.
Well, it's, some hard decisions coming up. Budget cuts, are we talking about? She has lowered the expectations for growth this year. I think that's fair to say, and smartly so. But could we actually see budget cuts, reduction in services? And is that a smart move?
Yeah, I mean,
should they get ahead? Should she get ahead of that?
The reality is that the city of Boston spends as much money as it raises in revenue every year. The idea that the city, that's just how the city's budget works. And what the mayor said in her letter in the beginning of December is that she'd asked for 2% budget cuts from city departments for FY27. That doesn't mean the overall budget is going to be cut. That's because of pension costs. We're seeing skyrocketing healthcare costs that people are feeling, and we're seeing deficits all over Massachusetts and
Debt
local
payments,
government. Debt payments, right? Like it costs a lot more to borrow money now than it did several years ago. But those are all going to continue to impact the city. We heard about building the new Madison Park High School. The reality is that building Madison Park High School is going to be an awful lot more expensive in terms of the materials, the construction costs, the debt, than it was a decade ago when Mayor Walsh proposed the Build BPS process that got bogged down.
She hasn't backed off from the White Stadium thing, despite some criticism. And Rep. Michaelwitz was talking about how all the precincts surrounding that area, White Stadium, Franklin Park, voted in favor of her. But are those the kinds of things that will come back and bite her, you think?
Well, I think on the linkage, I think there's been a couple of these linkages where people in the South End voted for Mayor Wu, people around White Stadium voted for Mayor Wu. Rep. Michaelwitz himself, he opposed the recent upzoning in downtown Boston that Mayor Wu's administration proposed.
Raising the building
heights?
heights?
Raising the building heights. So did Rep. Livingstone, even though both of them are big supporters of the mayor. And so the reality is that while the mayor certainly got reelected by a large margin, exactly what her coalition supports in terms of a governing agenda, I think is much less clear. And we saw that in this speech, right? They're just, like as Anthony touched on, there was very little details about anything the city was going to do, right? We heard about housing, but no housing policy proposals. We heard about education, but no education policy proposals. And so I think that's the big question, is like, what's actually going to be done in these next 4 years?
Well, and some would say she has a mandate, Anthony. She blew out a well-financed opponent in the preliminary. He dropped out. She didn't even have an opponent in the final, and of course, so her margins were huge. But still, does she have a mandate? And does that translate into influence with the state legislature? A lot of these items that she wants to accomplish or issues she wants to attack or require home rule possession.
Well, I think the thing that would be difficult to hold her to a mandate is that even in her campaign this cycle, there weren't many specific proposals that were policy proposals that were put forward. The campaign was very much run on grassroots energy, anti millionaires taking back our city, and it wasn't necessarily on a policy platform in the way that she even ran 4 years ago. And so I think that right now that they're just in a very strategic way. I think the mayor is avoiding any specifics right now as she starts to build out her platform and plan for these next 4 years. And I think that in that way it's hard to hold her to a mandate because we don't know exactly those specifics. We know people support her. She's a popular mayor, but what are the specifics that they're holding?
She's certainly got a lot of political capital, and she kind of exercised, or appears to have exercised some muscle in terms of the whole city council presidency and that whole thing, and which we'll talk more about in the future. But that said, can she afford to kind of back off from some of this rhetoric about Washington? I mean, she garnered a lot of praise and a lot of support, I think, as a result of going head-to-head, toe-to-toe with Trump and some of his congressional allies. But the fact of the matter is, it could really hurt the city. I mean, there could be a serious drop in revenue. Should she be pulling back from some of that high rhetoric, so to speak?
I don't think. I think this rhetoric, like, I think the reality is that what's going to happen at the federal level, I think, is kind of unknown. I do think that there's a lot of stuff the city could be doing at a local level to ensure its own budget. Like 70% of the budget comes from property taxes. A lot of that, a lot of new growth. In order to grow the budget, you have to build new buildings, and that's something that isn't decided on Beacon Hill or in Washington, D.C. It's decided in City Hall. We heard, Rep. Mikowitz was just on talking about ADUs. ADUs aren't legal in Boston the way they are in the rest of Massachusetts. They're not allowed by right. They're not allowed for non-related
This is the
people.
assisted
Granny flats, yeah.
Well, right. Your relative you can build on.
Exactly. And so if those were legal, it would be easier to build. There would be some amount of new construction in the city. That new construction can be taxed at a higher rate. That's more revenue for the city. Right. And I think those are the things that we, didn't really hear about on the campaign trail and didn't hear about in this speech.
Should she pull back a little bit though from some of that in your face? And she does it in a nice way, I think. But still, nonetheless, I think some people in Washington, I think, overly sensitive, and clearly they're out for revenge in many instances.
Politically, it benefits her. You see that the mayor's become, nationally, she's become one of the most popular mayors in the country.
A national figure, in fact.
In terms of mayors in the country, she's one of the most popular. And so I do think in terms of earned media, in terms of political process, in terms of fundraising, it benefits her. We'll see what it does for the city.
Well, very interesting. We've got just a minute or two left. Guys, the biggest challenge she faces in the coming year, in your opinion? I'll start with you, Anthony.
I would say the property tax bill.
Yeah. Getting that through the
legislature. It feels like that's going to be the biggest priority.
She seems to be pushing, and there could be opponents to Senator Collins and Senator Brownsberger. Does that work, or does that risk alienating them and perhaps the Senate?
Well, I think it's a political move.
Certainly got their attention.
Move, yeah, and it will also wake up their constituents to figuring out why these folks are challenging these strong incumbents as well.
Of course, they're offering some alternatives. Biggest challenge, Greg, that you think that she's facing? And how shall we judge her?
Yeah, I think the administration did a great job at maintaining labor peace. I think during its first term, they settled a lot of contracts.
For the fire department now.
I think the question is now going to be if we're looking at these, cuts to city departments, if we're looking at hundreds of jobs being lost in BPS, is that labor piece going to persist? What is BTU going to do with these school closures? What are the other city unions going to do in the face potentially of layoffs of city workforce? And what that kind of does to the political landscape in Boston, because you have had a pretty positive relationship between the city's public sector unions and the mayor.
Yeah, well, continue. Do you have any new reports coming out here?
We're working.
I know that stirs the pot,
We're putting together some stuff for 2026.
Yeah.
We're focused on property taxes. We're hoping to get another office values report out. So we're certainly working on things. We'll let you know when they come out.
All right, and Anthony, your priorities in the new year?
Just making sure that we're continuing to give back to the community, some electoral campaigns that we may be working on upcoming this year as well.
I think you're getting some attention as well, both of you. And thanks so much for coming in. Again, Greg Maynard, the founder and executive director of the Boston Policy Institute. Anthony Davis Jr., founder and CEO of the Davis System. Guys, thanks so much for joining us. You're watching Talk of the Neighborhoods here on the Boston Neighborhood Network. We're here tonight and every Thursday night at the same time. We'll be back next week. Until then, for the entire staff and crew here at the Boston Neighborhood Network, thank you for watching and listening. Have a great evening. Happy New Year and good night.